Good morning, everybody. My name is Momodu Toure. I am a policy advisor with AFRODAT, African Forum on Debt and Development. This study is a groundbreaking study. I just want to highlight 3 issues that came out of this study. Number one, that Africa is a net exporter of capital. It came as a shock to most economists. The second point is the share of IFFs, which is estimated to be in bank deposits, as to be very, very significant. That is another fundamental groundbreaking fact, that IFFs are in fact a key component of international capital markets. The third point is that all the conclusions of this study are based on existing international economic transactions. So it is within trade that the draining of African resources to build international capital markets is happening. Naturally, when you have those 3 conclusions in a study, the expectations are very, very high on what policy recommendations will come out of the study. And I join again, Madam, that there is some disappointment with the policy recommendations that come out of such an important study. I want to highlight just one. I will not go into all of them. We should avoid as much as possible to talk about domestic resource mobilization as a policy recommendation here. We are in effect saying to the rest of the world that not only are you taking our resources away from us, but we are going to mobilize ourselves again to tax our own people to finance our development. I have fought against this point about bringing domestic resource mobilization on the table. It is dangerous. We are in a period when development assistance is going down. To tell the donors that we can even make more effort again by taxing our people to support our development programs is dangerous. I think the bold policy recommendation that should come out of this is that Africa needs to recover those resources that it is losing, not through any other channel, but through trade, because trade is our integration to the international economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. Just a couple of comments. The first is, if I understand you right, you're using the World Bank residual measure approach, and that is based on the principles of attribution. There are a bunch of measures you can't explain. So you try to say this part is probably because of statistical mistake. This is going to be an illicit flow. Right? This part is illicit flow, this part is probably pure statistical discrepancy. So you are barely making an attribution. You're speculating about sources. You're mapping these residual measures to different sources. Okay, now to take that a little further, I'm going to push you to realize that you're trying to send incentives to corporations, and they understand what is called burden of proof. One thing is to say that this is illicit, another is to prove it. So we need to move our research beyond that measure to say, okay, what standard of proof can we take to court? Suppose we know that corporation XYZ is doing this, what kind of data can we take to the government and policymakers that will enable them push this? Let me give you an instance. The first instance is for us to tighten our customs and documentary procedure. And the International Chamber of Commerce already establishes a platform. There's a platform the banks use for documentary credit collection and procedure. So why can't we harmonize those accounting procedures so that when you import a car from Dubai, the custom doesn't say it's worth 35,000 when the person actually paid 10,000. In cases like that, there should be a way to resolve it so that you can reduce the noise. It starts making it easier. The second point I wish to make has to do with history. When you look at the capital flows in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you want to remember that those periods were periods of a lot of exchange control, pre-shipment inspection, which was also a way of dealing with the point you were making. And a lot of central banks had contracted SGS, for instance, Society Generale de Surveillance, to do pre-shipment inspection to avoid this kind of double counting or bogus counting. Now, what had happened then was, if you go to UBank, called unremitted bills proceeds awaiting exchange control approval. These are customers' payments to outside suppliers that sometimes wait for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months in the central bank. So what people were doing was legitimate resources. This is like yesterday when I said provenance could be legitimate, transfer could be legitimate. Because they couldn't get their money out of the countries because of the delay and the penalties, almost like a demurrage, they began to find illegitimate ways to transfer that money. So you find money that was legitimately made, but it was illegitimately transferred. So eventually, as the exchange control regulations began to be streamlined, some of these things were reduced. And the reason why history is important is that in formulating proactive policies, sometimes you have to understand how institutions respond to incentives in the system. And that would be a very good adjunct to the study that you've done. Because to simply find numbers without telling stories around that number, particularly if you look at some of those countries and the exchange control regimes at the time, you begin to map institutions to the data, and that enriches the study. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mervyn.
I am Abi Kader. I'm the author of one of the books that Leos was mentioning yesterday. My question is very brief. This is a very imperfect science. There is a lot of estimations, especially arbitrary decisions. You said you have used 10% as a cut-off point, especially 10% of the export value. I don't know the rationale behind it.
My name is Armin Dubisi. I'm the director of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Mozambique. First of all, I would like to congratulate the presenter for the cutting edge stuff that is just discharged. And secondly, to also congratulate the previous presenters for the studies that they have shared with us. My contribution is just a small one. As the director of the FIU, I'm privileged to participate in the meetings of our anti-money laundering regional grouping, SMLAC, as well as to the Financial Action Task Force. As we all know, the Financial Action Task Force is the global standard setter on money laundering and financing of terrorism. Having participating in these meetings, my feeling is that the issue of illicit financial outflows is not high on the agenda, both of the FATF as well as of the FATF style regional body. I'm talking more specifically about SMLAG, the regional AML safety grouping that Mozambique belongs to. I wouldn't say much about GIABA, that deals also with ML safety issues in West Africa. So maybe the reason for not having the illicit financial flows on high agenda are obvious. This is an African problem which must be also addressed by the African countries. So my small suggestion is that as we have a unique opportunity to have currently the high-level panel that is dealing with this matter. First of all, maybe the researchers that have brought to us these studies, I'm not quite sure whether they are in connection with the researchers that are working closely with the high-level panel, or maybe some of them may belong to this group. My suggestion would be that those findings should be in some way be taken to the consideration of this high-level panel, as it brings not only thorough findings, but also some policy recommendations. Because I understand that the ultimate objective of this high-level panel is to discharge the conclusion of its studies to our heads of states. So in this regard, I think that we have a unique opportunity to sensitize our heads of states in this regard. The second proposal is that also this matter should be taken to our regional anti-money laundering groups, so that it could be taken into consideration on their discussions and brought to the top of its agendas. Thank you.
Have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think really throughout this discourse from yesterday to the presentation this morning, what is coming out is really just quantifying what the problem is, helping policymakers understand that there's a real problem, and the continent is actually losing resources that it could be using for its own development. Obviously, I think the real issue really is the grand corruption issue that was talked to yesterday. Until we deal with this issue as Africans, until we accept that there is something that has gone wrong from a governance perspective, from a moral, perspective, because I don't know where our moral self went. Somewhere along the line, when I think, for example, personally about growing up in a village, your mother was there, she was telling you this is wrong, this is right, and you grew up knowing what was wrong and what was right. But now you find a situation where people will do things, as the Auditor General was saying yesterday. They know it's wrong, but to the extent that since they can get away with it, and go back to Melvin's issue, they will continue doing it. And I think until we grapple with that issue, until we really come out as to how do we deal with this, the problem will continue, and we'll continue doing studies and saying this is how big the problem is, this is what the policy issue should be, and so on. And the problem with this corruption issue is that it permeates all parts of the society. So even though we are talking about institution building, if you look at all the institutions, if people can be corrupted along the line, then you still will not be able to deal with the issue. So I don't know how we will address this, and I think I don't know if there's a policy recommendation for dealing with corruption. I know that institutions is one of them, and we've seen, if I look, for example, in my own country, because we have a very open and vibrant press, you can't really get away with some of the things you got away with in the 80s, 90s, and so on. But yet there are still sort of problems in the society. So I think that's one of the issues we need to address. The other one is really promoting investment within Africa itself. So instead of us going out or seeking, investment from outside. Maybe if we can trade more with ourselves, if we can invest more across Africa and so on, maybe these resources can find a home somewhere else in Africa, as opposed to fleeing and going to other areas of the globe. So, Chairman, that's.
Quick comment, Mr. Chairman. One is that during our research work, we've come to realize that if, for example, we try to assess the rate of compliance of developed countries, OECD countries, and Africa, as far as the 40+9 recommendations of FATF, which is Financial Action Task Force, which is the global institutional framework for fighting money laundering, then you find that most of the developed countries, compliance rate is very, very low. Not because of lack of capacity, because they have excess luggage in terms of capacity across the board. The problem is that of political will. Coming to Africa, you find exactly the same, but compounded by issues of lack of capacity. It's political will plus capacity constraints. That is the mixed greed you find in Africa. That's one. The second aspect, the issue of whether it is necessary to mobilize or to scale up domestic resource mobilization. Yes, we need to scale up because that will serve two purposes. One, it will reduce Africa's dependence on financing funding from donors. The second one, it will also scale efforts for plugging the loopholes in the area of illicit capital flows. So the strategy is twofold. While you are also scaling your efforts to mobilize domestic resources, you should also try to recover the lost asset and the lost values. The other issue which was raised by the colleague, the madam from Mozambique, the issue of institutional coordination, which is failing. You have the institutions in place, but those institutions, they don't speak to each other. They work as if they were silos. Take the example of trade-based money laundering, the case of counterfeit commodities. You expect then the domestic resource mobilization institutions to work hand in hand with the bureaus for standard setting and of course with the police. But if we find that the resource mobilization institutions are targeting, they have targets how much they want to mobilize in terms of revenues this year. They don't care about looking at the quality of the goods. And whereas the Bureau of Standards, they are looking at the quality of the goods. And the police, they are supposed to apprehend those who are having counterfeit commodities. But here is a police who is using a mobile phone, which is counterfeit, and you expect that a particular policeman to apprehend someone. Let's say that to apprehend me. If you were to apprehend me, I'll say, but my friend, Oga, you are having the same telephone like myself. So here now, there is a need for coordination of these institutions. So these institutions, they work as one. These institutions, they speak the same language. Without that, we won't be moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question it goes to not only Daniel, but also the...
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Derisa Degafa. I'm from ECA. My question goes to all the presenters who started presenting yesterday. I mean, I have bilaterally raised the question with Professor Leons, but still to the benefits of other presenters and the participants, I just want to raise the question again. The question is this: whenever the financial capital leaves the country, part of it might find a way going to in neighboring countries or somewhere in Africa. So in estimating the total illicit financial flows out of Africa, how does the methodology take care into this scenario when we report that Africa loses this much? Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me passer la parole. Moi, je m'appelle Faisal Abdoulaye, je suis du Cameroun. Je suis chargé d'études auprès du directeur général des impôts du Cameroun. Alors, je voudrais juste faire un petit commentaire sur les recommandations formulées par l'expert Daniel Garara au terme de son exposé. La recommandation qui a porté sur l'amélioration du climat des affaires. Juste pour dire que, de mon point de vue, il s'agit d'une recommandation fondamentale, parce que si nous réussissons à améliorer notre environnement des affaires, nous allons pouvoir mieux retenir les capitaux dans nos pays. Parce que si les capitaux vont à l'étranger, les flux illicites des capitaux, comme nous l'avons bien noté à partir de présentations faites hier, ces flux-là sont motivés par la recherche d'une meilleure rentabilité à l'extérieur. Du moment où nous avons déjà des opportunités d'investissement sur le continent, si nous améliorons le climat des affaires, nous pourrons donc mieux retenir ces capitaux-là sur le continent. L'autre chose que je voulais dire, ça porte sur la fiscalité. Nous avons pu partager depuis hier deux constats. J'ai pu noter globalement deux constats. Le premier est que la fiscalité est l'un des terrains privilégiés d'expression du phénomène de transfert de capitaux, transfert illicite de capitaux, à travers les pratiques de transfert de bénéfices, comme mon collègue a si bien exposé hier. Et nous avons également pu noter que les solutions ne peuvent être trouvées qu'au plan global, au plan mondial. Et l'observation que je voudrais faire est que aujourd'hui, ces solutions-là sont élaborées et portées par des instances dans lesquelles l'Afrique ne participe pas beaucoup. Nous avons l'OCDE qui a fait beaucoup de travaux sur les prix de transfert, sur le transfert de bénéfices de manière générale. Et il y a également l'ONU qui a fait beaucoup de travaux sur cette question-là. Ces deux instances-là ont adopté des principes applicables en matière de prix de transfert que nous appliquons également chez nous. Mais il serait souhaitable, de mon point de vue, qu'à partir de l'Afrique également, que nous puissions travailler sur ces questions importantes-là pour aboutir à des solutions qui soient adaptées à notre contexte également. Parce que le mois dernier, en mars, il y a eu une réunion du Forum mondial sur la transparence à l'OCDE, et l'une des conclusions de cette réunion est que les défis auxquels sont confrontés les pays développés ne sont pas les mêmes que ceux auxquels sont confrontés les pays sous-développés en matière de lutte contre les prix du transfert et du transfert de bénéfices de manière générale. Donc il est important que nous nous saisissions de ces questions-là à partir de l'Afrique, afin que des solutions adaptées à notre environnement puissent être trouvées. Et je pense que les instances comme le Consortium pour la recherche économique en Afrique sont bien indiquées pour impulser ce genre de réflexion, pour susciter des réflexions sur ces questions-là. Voilà globalement ma contribution. Je vous remercie.
I don't have much of it is a comment and kind of thinking framework that he's providing. But one thing that is really interesting that come out this one is foreign reserves are sitting outside of Africa and we don't have access to them, and we borrow from that. Yes, exactly. That is, we at the bank, we have what we call it Africa 50 Fund. The purpose of that fund is to mobilize this reserve is sitting outside so that it could be invested in African infrastructure. That is something that the bank is working along the line. And he has also raised a very interesting thing about negotiations and kind of how the contracts are really manipulated to benefit the other. And again, at the bank, we have what we call it African Legal Facility. That's exactly the job of that facility. It gives legal support for whoever is requesting. We have done a very good, we have provided interesting support for Liberia in terms of negotiating on a lot of foreign investments. So this is the kind of things that we have been doing. And one interesting thing that Esther and again, our Cameroonian colleague was saying is about the leaders, about corruptions and all these things. Yes, one thing that I was saying at the end of my presentation was there is what we call it the social conflict theory, that the leaders don't always provide us a good, what we call the good institutions. It's a kind of some, it's a solution for some kind of interaction game. It's a solution for a dynamic game. And how it is played, how it's shaped, is something that we really have to think about it. But policy reforms, they don't come by themselves. Mostly leaders could not have interests, or the leaders might have different interests than maximizing social welfare. So how to solve it is a great challenge to the panel. I think, yeah, I stop here.
Thanks.